In the orange dust before dawn, a train curved into a shallow cutting north of Kimberley. The engineer saw only scrub and stone, then a sudden scatter of cattle across the track. He leaned on the whistle. The animals did not move. Brakes screamed, cars buckled, and the line went still. Men who had been lying in the grass all night rose on the slopes. A handkerchief flicked once, Mausers cracked. Glass blew inward, the guard's lamp spun, and the first car filled with smoke and splinters. When the whistle finally died, the raiders were already dragging rifles and cartridge boxes into sacks, tossing the empty signal lantern down the embankment, and putting distance between themselves and the wreck before the nearest garrison could steam out to look. This is what the fighting became after British troops marched into Boer capitals in 1900 and declared the war as good as over. The opening year had been sieges and set-piece battles. The next two were leaner. Boer commandos cut free of towns and supply wagons. They lived on horses and on whatever a farm could spare. They moved at night, read tracks at a gallop, and learned where the railways and telegraph lines were soft. A company that left a fort at sunrise could find its remount herd gone by noon and the wire down behind it by afternoon, while the men who had done it were already 20 miles away, riding for a dry riverbed and a mouthful of coffee warmed over a tiny fire. The fighters knew the country the way a rancher knows his fence lines. Louis Botha in the east, Coos de la Rey on the western grass, Christian de Wet in the orange Free State. Names that moved like weather. A commando might be 60 riders or 600. Some wore captured uniforms. Most wore coats they had worked in at shearing or harvest. Rifles stayed clean, saddles patched, plans penciled on tobacco tin lids. Hit a water tank here, lift a train guard's carbines there, scout a wire line, and be gone before dawn. Success meant a few more rounds in the bandolier, a sack of meal, and the hope your horse would hold another week. Britain answered with reach. Lord Kitchener drew lines on maps and then built them across the veld. Blockhouses, stone or corrugated towers, rose along the rails and then spread like a net, each within sight of the next, tied together with barbed wire. Armored trains clanked post to post. Flying columns rode sweeping drives, trying to pen riders against the wire or a waterless ridge. It was a plan to turn speed into a trap and make the war a grid instead of a chase that never ended. The price landed on families. Columns burned farmhouses that could shelter fighters and destroyed grain that could feed them. Whole districts were cleared. Women, children, and the elderly were herded into camps near towns. The camps were meant to protect the displaced and empty the countryside of support. Instead, they became places where disease outran supplies. Water ran foul, tents leaked, measles swept through. A British reformer, Emily Hobhouse, wrote what she saw, and a commission followed. Conditions slowly improved, but graves filled faster than wagons brought flour. Black South Africans, brought into separate camps or working on the lines, suffered heavily and were rarely counted with care. The ledger of loss was not a book anyone balanced. It was a row of mounds outside the wire. On the veld, the war kept its own hours. A patrol might ride 3 days and see no one, only ash where a farmhouse had been and a dim track leading into a dry riverbed. Then a thin volley would walk along the dust at saddle height, and a man would be down, surprised that it felt cold before it burned. When the British caught their quarry, it was by weight of numbers, cornered against wire or rock and brought in with wagon loads of prisoners and rifles stacked like cordwood. On other days, a column hit nothing but wind and heat, and men boiled tea with brackish water, while scouts stared at the horizon until their eyes watered. The rails were arteries and weaknesses at once. Guards stacked sandbags on flat cars. Sappers walked sleepers with lanterns cupped in their hands. At night, raiders moved close, counted steps from a culvert, buried a charge, and timed a fuse by feel. A broken section under an armored train, through sparks and iron, and the sound carried for miles. By the time a repair gang arrived under a half-circle of rifles, the men who did it were gone, their tracks braided with cattle to hide the count. Not every Boer rider stayed out. Some handed over rifles at blockhouses, worn down by hunger and the long odds. Others, the bitter enders, or bitter enders, refused and went leaner still, splitting into bands that followed the seasons. They learned to strip a saddle in the dark and put it back together by touch. They knew which farms kept a sack of meal under the floor and which ones would bring a column by daybreak. Letters traveled wrapped in oiled cloth and stitched under a shirt hem. The living ran on promise and memory. The dead left horses and boots that were measured, claimed, and taken back into the ring. The line between war and home kept breaking. A farmer who had planted in hope one winter might ride with a commando by spring after his barns were burned. A British private who had enlisted for adventure found himself posting burial lists from the camps and writing home without explaining why he could not sleep. Scouts on each side read sign the way a sailor reads weather. Larks circling low meant a horse had been tied there at dawn. Springbok bolting the wrong way meant men were where animals did not expect them to be. Every clue was a sentence in a language learned under strain. Certain engagements set the temperature. De Wet's escapes from closing circles became both legend and problem set for the men chasing him. De la Rey's counterattacks, sharp enough to send whole columns stumbling, convinced Kitchener to multiply posts and tighten wire. Botha's work in the East kept the war from ending early and forced the British to stretch their drives across country that killed horses and wore feet raw. None of that won the war alone. All of it together exhausted the riders who were asked to keep moving while their families waited behind canvas. The end arrived the way the campaign had gone on, piecemeal, then suddenly. In the winter of 1901 to 1902, the drives grew heavier, and the camps, under new rules, steadier. Ammunition and remounts were scarce. Commandos were short of shoes and salt. With each surrender, more men sat in the lee of blockhouses, quiet over tin mugs. In May 1902, leaders rode to talks at Vereeniging and counted what was left. They gave up the republics in exchange for amnesty, food for the camps, and money to rebuild. The promise of eventual self-government lay on the table like a down payment on a future that would not arrive quickly. After the signing, columns unwound along the roads they had worn into the earth. Rail crews laid new sections where culverts had blown. Trains began to run without testing every bridge with a handcar. Families left camps and came back to foundations lit by afternoon sun. They stood where the front door had been and measured what could be raised before the next rain. On the far edge of the grass, a boy found a rifle hidden in a stone fence and tucked it under his coat, a secret he carried into peace. Years later, the blockhouse lines lay like faint scars across the veld. Children climbed them and played sentry. Men argued over the meanings of surrender and survival. The guerrilla years taught hard lessons about how a small, mobile force can pull at a larger one until it frays, how an empire can answer with wire and fire, and how civilians can suffer more than any mounted column. Those lessons did not belong only here. They traveled outward to other wars, carried in notebooks and in memory. If you go back to that cutting at first light, the rails gleam, and the air smells of creosote and dust. You can hear a train long before you see it. For a moment, the sound brings back riders rising from the grass and a whistle that would not move cattle that were never loose. The ambush is gone, but its shape remains, the sense that a war can be everywhere and nowhere at once, and that its shadow falls long after the last shot. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.